Welcome to the second webinar in a series focusing on welcoming and supporting newly arrived pupils who have been displaced. Today's webinar will be slightly longer than usual as we have a great panel of 5 speakers, and we also wanted to give every participant time to ask our speakers questions. As our schools, academies, multi-academy trusts, colleges and local authorities have welcomed or are currently welcoming or will be very shortly welcoming newly arrived pupils from Hong Kong, Afghanistan, Ukraine and other conflict-torn parts of the world, they have rightly focused their attention and efforts on addressing the key challenges that may affect these children's education in the UK. In particular, there have been many staff training initiatives in schools focusing on dealing with trauma, grief, anxiety, and isolation, as well as on academic challenges. Unfortunately, the resettlement process for these children and young people who have been displaced is taking place in England at a time when English as an additional language is absent from any national oversight or provision of professional qualifications or staff development and specialist roles for teachers and other school staff working with children who use English as an additional language, which means that there are currently no national policies to generate and maintain EAL expertise in schools, in the words of one of our speakers, Joe Hutchinson, so that they can offer the kind of support that these pupils need as soon as they set foot in our educational system. Today's panel of speakers will explore why and how languages, both the languages that these learners bring and English, the language of instruction in English schools, must take center stage as a vital tool and resource while newly arrived pupils adjust to an unfamiliar educational environment and beyond. Before I introduce our 5 speakers, I would like to briefly explain the structure of this webinar. So let me show you very briefly who the speakers are. Each speaker will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes maximum. After they finish their short talks, there will be time to ask any questions that you may have. Please feel free to use the Q&A box to send any questions as they come to you, and I will collect them and post them to Catherine, Rishan, Joe, Diana, and Caroline at the end. Tomorrow, you will receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of the webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speakers in the order in which they will speak. So first, in a minute, we will listen to Catherine Gladwell, founder and chief executive of Refugee Education UK, a charity which helps refugee and asylum seeker children and young people get into and thrive in education from primary school to university. Catherine will provide an overview and background to contextualize the issue of language in refugee education. Our second speaker will be Rishan Tsegay, one of the first youth ambassadors at KRAN, Kent Refugee Action Network. Hello, Rishan, there she is. KRAN works with separated young refugee and asylum seekers aged 16 to 24 who have arrived in Kent alone and are claiming asylum, and provides them with a safe, positive space supporting them to succeed. You will hear more about Rishan later, but she's been in KRAN first as a service user and then as a youth ambassador for over 3 years. And she will share with us her past experiences as a newly arrived refugee, and Rishan and I will have an informal chat together. Our third speaker will be Joe Hutchinson, Director for Social Mobility and Vulnerable Learners at the Education Policy Institute, an independent and evidence-based research institute that aims to promote high-quality education outcomes for all children and young people. Joe will summarize key research findings regarding the educational outcomes of pupils who have English as an additional language and of those who are refugees. Our fourth speaker will be Diana Sutton, Director of the Bell Foundation, a charity that works to overcome exclusion through language education through 3 programs: children with English as an additional language, adults with ESOL, and criminal justice. Diana will explore implications and recommendations for policy. Our fifth and final speaker will be Caroline Bruce, Acting Training Manager at the Bell Foundation. Before joining the foundation, Caroline taught English in a city academy for almost 20 years and coordinated the provision for learners using English as an additional language. Caroline will offer recommendations for senior leaders in schools. Enough of me now, let's listen to our first speaker. So over to you, Caroline. Sorry, Catherine. Hello.
No problem. That happens more often than you might think. There's something about Catherine and Caroline that's obviously just interchangeable. But thank you, Silvana. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. As Silvana said, Refugee Education UK is all about helping refugee children get into education in this country and then thriving in that education. And that's both academically and in terms of their psychosocial well-being. And then to be able to use that education in ways that are meaningful to them. So firstly, we do that through our direct education support programs. So we work directly with between 700 and 800 young refugees each year through things like educational mentoring, casework, advice and guidance sessions, and wellbeing support sessions. And we're also developing at the moment a new education welcome response program, particularly in light of the significant new arrivals that we've seen from Afghanistan since the summer, and that we're anticipating the growing numbers arriving from Ukraine at the moment. Secondly, we do this through our training, capacity building and research programs, where we conduct research either UK focused or internationally around aspects of education for young refugees and asylum seekers. And happily at the moment, we have a project that we have the pleasure of working on with the Bell Foundation that kind of bridges the gap between those and looks at some of the gaps in English language acquisition for young refugees and asylum seekers, and how volunteers can be used to address some of those in the context of a new framework, which is really exciting to be working on. But what I'm going to use my time to touch on today is just a few findings from a combination of various different research programs that we've run, and also our own work that have kind of just revealed a few particular things about English language and its role in kind of becoming more integrated in life in the UK for refugee children and young people. So a couple of years ago, we carried out some research in partnership with UNICEF UK, and it looked at what were the barriers to educational access and educational thriving for refugee children. And the two most significant barriers that came out through this research were English language challenges and mental health challenges. And this has really been backed up by kind of subsequent research that we've done since then, and also all of the internal monitoring grey literature that we have from our own direct programs work. And of course, I mean, it's probably evident to everybody here today that these two key challenges that refugee children experience can be something of a vicious circle, with each of them aggravating the other, and English language level affecting well-being and vice versa, which I'll touch on. But I just wanted to draw out a few key points that have come out through these things about how language really is key for young refugees, both in accessing education here in the UK, then thriving in that education once they're in the door, and progressing in education as they move up all the way through to university. So accessing education to start off with, right from the point of arrival, we found that language is a critical enabling factor or barrier for refugee children simply getting into school, and not just their own language, but and of course, particularly for younger children, their parents' English. So in this research that we carried out for UNICEF, as well as our kind of daily experience with families, the majority of parents that participated in this research didn't speak English when they arrived in the UK. Over half of the parents that we interviewed for this particular research study had only had primary education themselves and weren't computer literate. And so in terms of accessing education, we find this kind of perfect storm where our online online admissions systems bring language inequalities and tech inequalities into this collision, which really presents something of a quite a concrete barrier when those things come together. And a third of the parents that we have worked with over the years, and it was similar figures that are represented in the data from this research, have simply found that they just couldn't navigate the system because of these two barriers coming together. We see particularly the different routes that people come through to the UK affecting this. So some resettlement programmes come with types of support where resettled families have support workers who can sit with them and help them through some of these things. Those who come through the asylum route and seek asylum here tend to have got a lot less support in that. And so just getting in the door at that point of arrival has been a real challenge. And we've had children and young people waiting up to 9 months to get an education place in the UK at the statutory level. Of course, that's for a whole variety of reasons, but navigating the systems and the role of English language in that has been a really key one. Secondly, thriving in education. So assuming those access barriers can be overcome, and when they are overcome, once in school, the most significant barrier to thriving in education, as kind of self-reported by young refugees in actually all of the research projects that we've done over the past few years that have asked this question, has been difficulties obtaining the requisite level of English to catch up with their peers in terms of the subjects that they're studying. In the first research project that we did with UNICEF, and this is 2 years ago now, that interviewed the greatest number of young people, over half of them said that this was their primary challenge in terms of thriving academically in their education. And of course, as I think has already been alluded to and no doubt will be spoken about more, this is in the context of the last 10 years of specific central government funding for EAL pupils kind of eroding, and schools being faced with having to buy back EAL support especially. And yet in that context, lower resources, less specialism, and drastic need, and that's been increasing in numbers since last summer. Again, we see that this is exacerbated by language barriers at the family level. Kind of family support for education coming from parents in the form of reading or phonics practice at the primary level, or navigating school information platforms, just being really problematic. And we've seen enormous differences in terms of attainment for children in schools where that either has been provided for parents and schools where it hasn't been. So family, again, coming in as really important, both in the research and in our practical work. And finally, in linking this to kind of mental health in terms of the thriving in education, I think it kind of goes without saying, but I do want to emphasize it anyway, that language is not just about academic attainment, it's about relationships and a sense of belonging and being able to grow friendships. And when EAL provision is low and language acquisition is slower, then we've seen real psychosocial and social challenges being exacerbated for children, and levels of bullying increase. And then on top of that, children being unable to access talking therapies or other forms of in-school support that might be provided in the mental health space because of the lack of English language. And so again, you see that vicious circle continuing. Finally, progression, again, limited hours in ESOL. We're seeing children stay in FE for several years, even when they've got subject-specific expertise, which means they should be studying at a higher level, but just not being able to do that because they can't build the English language expertise fast enough because of the lack of provision. And again, that loop then closes back to mental health with depression, a lack of progress coming in. So I guess in terms of concluding, I would just set the scene by saying we really do see language is critical for refugee children at all stages of the cycle of education. And for me, I'm really delighted just to be here today and have the chance to listen with you to some of the EAL experts that are going to be diving into more of the detail of this now. Thanks, Silvana.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and we are delighted to have you. And thank you for laying the kind of overview and giving us concrete and specific points about what are the challenges and how, basically knowledge of the English language is so central and fundamental for children with, who are refugees, asylum seekers, etc. Thank you so much. So now we are going to have a chat with Rishan. So hi, Rishan, and thank you so much for joining us today. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? So how old are you, what you do, and anything else you might want to tell us about yourself?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me for this webinar, and thank you for the participant for attending. So my name is Rishan Tsegay. I'm from Eritrea, but I grew up in Sudan. I came in 2015 to the UK as a refugee, and now I've been to college, and from college I now study at Canterbury Christchurch University, and I'm doing adult nursing.
Thank you. Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened? What were your experiences of education before you came to the UK? So were you, for example, able to go to school normally? Was it difficult or impossible to attend school?
So, as I said, I grew up in Sudan, so I haven't been to like a proper school as similar to here in the UK. But the only thing I had is our neighbor was a university teacher, so he used to give me lesson for English and maths, and that was the only education that I had. But the rest of it, I was just learning from TV and especially the English language. So I've been listening a lots of English, but not with the writing. So I'm good at speaking, but with the writing, I was really weak, and I'm still weak with that, to be honest. So that's kind of for my head.
Rishan, how many different languages do you speak?
So as I said, I'm from Eritrea, so I understand and I speak Tigrinya, which is the first language in Eritrea. And because I grew up in Sudan, so my first language is Arabic. So now Tigrinya and Arabic in English.
Thank you. So what was your level of English, more or less? You said you were, your speaking is good, but before you arrived in the UK, were you able to speak English? And if so, how, to what level, how well, etc.?
So when I came here, I used to just understand a little bit of English because obviously all the movies and the songs that I've been listening back in Sudan. But in terms of speaking, I wasn't that much confidence. Even if I know something, I didn't have the confidence to say something, but I would understand a few things or trying to guess what someone's saying to me. So that's why when I came here, I straight away been in KRAN, Kent Refugee Action Network, for just small like lessons English, but it wasn't like as a school. So I haven't been to school. I've been straight away to Canterbury College. So my understanding was a few better than my speaking when I came to here.
Catherine was talking about how long sometimes children who arrive in the UK have to wait before they can join school or college. So how soon after your arrival in the UK did you join a school or college in your case?
So when I came here, it was in June. Obviously, all the college and they was just closed because it starts September and then finishing to June to July, as everyone knows. So I didn't have it straight away. Haven't been to any like education because I've been placed in foster family. That's the only like English that I learned from them. So every like at 7 p.m. me and my foster we watch the TV, and then I ask her what they say and what is this and what is that. So that kind of the first thing that I learned in English, like sitting with my foster carer and trying to go through all the movies or M&L or Extender to learn catch up things and to have the confidence to speak out. So that's the only thing. And then KRAN, as I said, but in KRAN is not like a formal like lesson as in college or school. So we learn different things like about the royal family, about the system in the UK. So different kind of thing. That's why we call it learning for life instead just learning English.
Thank you. And once you joined college, can you tell us a little bit about your lessons and what other work you did outside of lessons, your classes? You've already started telling us about EastEnders and things like that, but anything else about your self-study?
So because I didn't have any like a formal paper or any qualification, I started, it's called access opportunity, which is basic like ESO, English, maths and English, and IT. So that's the first thing I did it. And then after that, when I passed my maths and English, I start health and social care level 1. But beside the course, they have an ESOL like tutor where you go and then you learning and then you go back. So most of the time that I spend it is in the library with myself, like trying to catch up things and to learn, or go back to my foster care and then show her what I think if that I needed help with it. But with the ESOL, at the time when I started, it was a few young people, refugees. So there's more hours and more like teacher to teach. But now it's became the demand for ESOL a lot, and now you can't find it, because when last time I left college, I couldn't find like to book for a slot to have a ESOL or any support with the GCSE maths and English. So things has been changing.
Okay. And how important was it for you to learn English to settle in your life in the UK, for your studies, to make friends?
Because I didn't have a proper school or education back in home. So when I came here, I really wanted to go to learn. And even my mom, she used to say to me, go and educate, like, so you can work and get certificate and work any like course that you wanted to achieve. So it was really important for me. Even sometimes I get really frustrated because of, I understand the lesson, but I don't know how to put it, especially in academic writing and paraphrase things. And so it was difficult and challenging, but at the same time, the more I achieve something, the more I feel like really satisfied, and I just continue doing it and doing it. But it took a lot of time for me because I used to spend most of my time in the library, even after the session, just to, especially with the GCSE maths and English, it was the most really difficult things for me to achieve it. But again, I always tend to access help for my foster care, because I had a foster care, but most of my friends live in a shared house. They don't have someone to kind of continue with them for the education or the support they needed. And as I mentioned earlier, there was an ESOL, like a tutor, like extra after the session. So I used to use that most of the time. Even sometimes they get fed up of me, but I just continue like asking questions for that. So it's challenging and satisfying at the same time.
So what would you say was the best thing that your teachers did for you, and your call, the support that you got? What were the best things about that?
There's so many things, to be honest. I would say the basic things needed for in terms like how to reference now is really basic for me. When I enter university, it was just familiar myself with it. So most of the basic like how to like grammar, I'm still struggling with it, to be honest. But in terms like how to find resources, academic resources, and how to find something that I could understand, not normally like just teaching, but again, how the way my background in terms of culture, in terms of things, my teacher, because she had the ESOL, not the course itself, but the ESOL teacher, the extra one, they have a like background about refugee, like about like Eritrean or young people from Afghanistan or different. So they understand how I wouldn't say how we think, but how we understand some things. So that kind of background understanding of how I'm repeating myself, but it's really helped me, make it easier for me to say what I want to say, and how access like any like sources academic, or how to write things down, or how to speak out, like if I have a presentation or have anything. So it was really supporting.
And my last question, what would be the 3 most important things that schools and colleges should do or could do to welcome and support new arrivals who were forced to migrate?
So I've been saying the ESOL, like it did really help me beside the course that I've been doing, because every time if I have assignment that I've written, I go back and show them and say, what do you think of my writing? Like, is it academic? So it's been my teacher really helped me. Like he says, Rishan, you need to take out, we don't say this in academic writing, this is informal or this is formal. So kind of this support. But as I said, is the demand of having that session or slot is became like really less because of the now in college when I left it, and it's still now there's lots of refugees, so it's different. It was only 2 teachers, so I don't know how things change. But in any school or college, if there is this extra support of for the young person, or like any like to go and show their their work, how they've done it. It could be really helpful. And again, some of the young people that I know, or myself, I would know something, but I don't have the confidence to say it. So in terms of having like a group session, and it could be like art or like drama or any session that can build the confidence of the young person, just to have that, it is really like important. I had this when I was going to KRAN, and because I've met other young people from English, like English kids or other like different. So I used to meet them, and then I feel like comfortable. So when I go to the class, I don't feel like isolated, or I don't know if something I know it. If something I don't know it, I straight away just ask a question. I don't leave something without making sure that I understand. But you see some of the young people, like they know the answer, but because of lack of, like, I wouldn't say lack of confidence, but they shy, or they feel, no, I'm wrong, or they be like themselves, they don't have the courage to say something. But if there is other like session, like make it group session, could be really supportive.
Okay, thank you so much, Rishan. There will be opportunities later for participants to ask more questions of Rishan, and also the panel if you want to pose some questions later and talk to Rishan. Thank you so much. So now we're going to welcome our third speaker, Joe Hutchinson. So over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Silvana, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are not familiar with the Education Policy Institute, our speciality is using the government's education data to undertake research and to understand more about challenges within the school system in England. And we have been looking at young people with English as an additional language, in particular since 2017. And in fact, those children are identified directly within the government's data sets. So that's fairly simple for us to do. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we know about this whole complete group of young people who speak English as an additional language. And then I'm going to tell you about some newer research that we have done that is more specifically about refugee and asylum seeking children in particular. So to start off with, so looking at the latest year's results that we have available, we've been looking at the 2020 GCSE results, so the first year during the pandemic, and how did students speaking English as an additional language perform within those results. And what we found there is that there was a gap equivalent to 1.6 GCSE grades for young people who speak English as an additional language and have arrived in schools in England in year 10 or 11. So the EAL group as a whole is incredibly diverse, but we focus in particular on those who've arrived later in the system, had less time to learn English before they have to sit tests or exams. So 1.6 grades lower than those for whom English is a first language. This is a small increase in that disadvantage there from 2019. And in fact, this is a finding that we were quite concerned about, because in general, in 2020, students got higher GCSE results than in previous years. This was because the centre assessed grade system that was the sort of emergency arrangement when the exams had to be cancelled in 2020 resulted in some slightly more generous grading across the board, but young people who speak English as an additional language were one of only two groups who didn't share in that increasing grades, and the other was children with special educational needs and disabilities. So generally speaking, we know from looking at prior years that the later a pupil joins a school in England for the first time, on average, the lower their attainment will be. So there's almost a linear relationship between the year in which they arrive in the system and how late that is before GCSEs and the attainment outcomes in terms of GCSE results. So late arrival there is really acting as a proxy for lower English proficiency and having had less time to improve English or to even begin learning English in some cases before the time of the GCSE exams. So it's important, though, that we don't forget that what we see from the wider group of EAL pupils is that overall, for those who have already arrived or in many cases been born in England and are in schools in England from reception year group, on average, they have slightly above average attainment outcomes. So it's important for us to know that the potential for young people who speak English as an additional language is just as good as for any other students, and they are able to benefit from education if provided with the support that they need. So that's a bit about the general picture for the wider group of children who speak English as an additional language. What is not available in government's data sets is information about which children and young people are refugees or asylum seekers. They don't collect that information, with the exception, a small exception, of those who are unaccompanied asylum seeking children. Those children can be identified through local authority children's services records, because they are looked after children if they're not accompanied by any family members. But for the rest of the refugee and asylum seeking group, we don't know who they are. So this posed us with a challenge, because essentially it meant we didn't know what their outcomes were like. We didn't know which schools they went to. We didn't know what their GCSE results were like. We didn't know anything really about what happened to them within England's education system. So what we did to try and address this gap in the evidence was to combine a lot of education data. So looking at that point of school entry into English schools, looking at the status of English as an additional language, looking at free school meals eligibility, and looking at the specific first language spoken by children in the education records. And then we combined that with some other data from the Home Office on the numbers of resettlements and the numbers of asylum claims that there were in particular years, and also the data on asylum support for families that require financial support while they're going through the asylum system. And we combined all that together to create a kind of probability for each child's record in the education data that that child might or might not be a refugee or asylum seeker. And then we use these probabilities and do a weighted analysis. And that's given us the first ever estimates of outcomes for the refugee and asylum seekers groups. So looking at the subset of refugee and asylum seekers who do have family with them, what we found was that the GCSE results were quite low at the 29th percentile. And just to give you an idea of what that means, it's fairly similar to children who are living in long-term poverty, who are eligible for free school meals for most of their school career. So it's similar to a gap of around 1.6 GCSE grades, and somewhat larger than the disadvantage gap that we most often talk about for all disadvantaged children, which is about 1.2 grades. So we then also looked at unaccompanied asylum seeking children, those living in the care system, and their GCSE results, and found those were even lower again, as we might expect, at the 12th percentile. So that's behind 88% of children within the GCSE data. And it's a similar level to children with more severe special educational needs and disabilities, those that qualify for an education, health and care plan. So that gap is around 3.6 grades. So really, really sort of fairly severe gaps that weigh up against some of the most disadvantaged groups within the system that we're seeing there. And we were also able to look at children's school attendance and exclusion records, and found that for the unaccompanied asylum seeking children group, but not for other refugee and asylum seeking children, they also had above average levels of school absence and fixed period exclusions or suspensions from school. So some signs there of the difficulties faced by those children joining English schools, and really the sort of reasons why we all need to be concerned with helping those children to settle in and to improve their English language in whatever ways that we can. I'm just going to finish off by saying that this is really kind of highlighted that the government doesn't collect any information on which children are refugees and asylum seekers. So we didn't used to know anything about them, and that's in itself perhaps a bit of a problem, that if we want to see these things improve, then we need to be able to measure outcomes.
Thank you so much, Jo. And now it's time for our fourth speaker, Diana. So over to you, Diana.
Thank you, Silvana, and thank you everybody for your interest. And I can see from the chat there's a lot of interest in the webinar subject, so we're delighted to be able to host it. And please do make suggestions at the end for areas where you would like more support. I can see there's very many of you working at a practical grassroots level in schools, and Caroline will be talking much more about practical suggestions. I'm going to talk about what the implications are for policymakers, both at the national level and the regional level, in terms of how new arrivals are supported with language acquisition. I think the first thing to say is the importance of funding and providing language support for longer than 3 years in the system, recognising that for many groups, particularly those without prior English language knowledge, some of whom may also not have first language literacy, 3 years will not be sufficient time to develop the language needed for academic study. Currently, the school's funding formula only mandates 3 years EAL funding in the system. Research that we funded and conducted by Professor Steve Strand and Ariel Lindorf shows that it takes 7 years to acquire the academic literacy needed for success. And other countries, the US, Canada, support ELL learners, as they're called, for much longer. So this is really essential. If you join at 4 and you acquire proficiency in English and you have 2 languages, you will outperform. But if you join later in the system and you only get 3 years of support, you won't. I think that brings me on to my second point, really, and Caroline will talk a little bit more in detail about this, the importance of content and language assessment and the importance of assessing proficiency in English. Again, research shows us that it is proficiency in English that has the strongest correlation with attainment for EAL learners. And this is much stronger than other variables in the system. For example, disadvantage. The proficiency indicator is a much stronger indicator of performance for EAL learners. And schools need to know how to assess this meaningfully and routinely. Schools should be collecting data on proficiency in English and be able to measure progression between the competency bands. This happens in some schools in the devolved nations in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, but it is not in place for England. It was temporarily introduced for a 2-year period and some data was collected. If possible, and if you have the support and the tools available locally and can do a home language assessment as well, this will give you an indication of the learner's ability in their home language. And also, if you can, encourage parents to support the child in their home language. If they can't obviously support in English, this can be very, very helpful. So it's not a question of positioning one language against another language, but using what the home language can help provide. I think it's also important, as with any child, really, no one size fits all. Refugee arrivals, like EAL learners more broadly, will have very different profiles and very different abilities and knowledge of both subject content and of English, depending on their age and their time of arrival, the country they've come from, their prior education and their prior attainment. So this will be very different. So an individualized approach to the child, viewing the child as a child and undertaking an assessment and not one size fits all approach is the way to go. As Jo said, The later a child arrives in the system, in general, the worse their outcomes will be. And it's important that in policy terms, there's some sort of late arrival premium in the school's funding formula to ensure that children arriving late in the system are sufficiently supported with funds for language support. We are aware of 1 or 2 colleges doing very innovative under 16s provision, because for some under 16 schools won't be suitable because of the young person's lack of language, and FE college provision may be more appropriate. We are aware of 1 or 2 colleges doing innovative and important work with 14 to 18-year-olds to develop suitable provision to enable a young person to access the curriculum and learn English. But there's much more work needed here to map, develop and evaluate and build on the work of those colleges that are doing this, and also how this is funded. Moving on now to the more general point about continuous professional development and ensuring the development of language support and training in the system. Since the Ethnic Minority Achievement Grant, which was a dedicated grant that existed in the system to support EAL learners and other minority attainment groups, was mainstreamed into the school's funding formula, local authority expertise in supporting language acquisition for vulnerable groups who speak English as an additional language has all but disappeared. We are aware of this shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and Joe Hutchinson's report documents this very, very thoroughly, and that was a few years ago now, and there's even less of it in the system. So at regional and national level, it is important for this system to invest in the development of this support and in training teachers continually at all stages in their career to support multilingual learners, through from initial teacher training right through to senior leadership, because most teachers in their careers will be teaching to the multilingual classroom. And finally, to conclude, it's really important to take an asset-based approach. What can a refugee child or young adult achieve with the right support in place? What skills do they bring? What is the competence in their home language? We recently heard from a refugee in a project that we're supporting who's now studying for a PhD, having also learnt his English off EastEnders, which is a shocking reflection on our system, but an extraordinary reflection on this individual, and is now studying computer science. So important to take an asset-based approach when supporting refugee children and young adults. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. And finally, over to Caroline for our final presentation. And Caroline will be discussing what schools and colleges can do. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. There's some really, really fascinating points being made there. And obviously, it's impossible to cover absolutely everything. So this is only intended to be a few key pointers. And I'd actually like to just start with a quote from our REUK, actually. So education is protective. It's how these children will begin to rebuild their lives and look towards their futures. So we know, you know, from everything that everybody has spoken about so far, particularly from Rishan's comments, the value of education. And I suppose I want to sort of make a few key points. I'll just say those key points first and then elaborate on them. So first, and this ties in with some of the questions that are coming into the chat box as well, the value of integrating children who are new arrivals into mainstream lessons. Linked to that and linked to all of the discussion so far, particularly perhaps Joe's, the urgent need for accelerated language support. Linked to that, the case for assessing proficiency in English, not just as a one-off, but as an ongoing support. Linked to Diana's comments, an asset-based approach to multilingualism. And then finally, the urgent need for CPD for teachers and professionals working with children who are using English as an additional language. So then thinking about going back now and thinking about the value of integrating into mainstream, I know we've had some questions about particularly about children arriving into secondary school. And we know that for the most part, children who are newly arrived will benefit from being integrated into mainstream lessons as soon as possible. Michael Evans and another group have elaborate on this idea in their book Towards an Inclusive Pedagogy for EAL and the Multilingual Classroom. And at its absolute simplest, the classroom with the opportunity to be with their peers is the best place to achieve academic inclusion, linguistic inclusion, and social inclusion. Academic inclusion, because we know that the classroom teacher is the best source of academic learning. They're the subject experts, and it's important to remember that students are arriving quite often with subject knowledge already. It's the language that's proving the barrier to their progressing with their education, rather than their necessarily their academic ability. And so making sure that students are able to access those lessons and achieve academic inclusion will be key for good practice in the classroom. So the linguistic inclusion, we know that the classroom is the best place for linguistic inclusion because students will have access to different teachers and to all of their peers and all of the different varieties of English, that makes their experience much more valuable, rather than being protected with perhaps one teacher, one supportive teacher who's perhaps adapting their language, then maybe not having so much experience and so much variety of English. And perhaps most importantly then, the classroom is the ideal opportunity for social inclusion, because classroom learning with opportunities for collaboration and discussions they're an excellent means of fostering relationships and friendships between learners. And the aim, of course, is for a child to feel settled and involved as soon as possible. And tied in with this social inclusion, we don't just think about the social inclusion. If we think about the whole school, we think about the social inclusion of families as well as just the learners themselves. So thinking back to what Catherine was talking about the importance of developing good relationships with families and carers, and and whether that's having meetings, for example, before a child starts in the school, and having that important induction meeting and a tour of the school, and making sure that there's an interpreter there, making sure that documents are translated into first languages, and fostering those relationships that can be so vital to ensuring that children have a really positive relationship with school, and go on to make the absolute most of it. And that links in as well with I'll touch on this in a second, but thinking about the use of first languages, and making sure that families understand the value of maintaining that first language, and can be actively involved in supporting education at home in the first languages is obviously absolutely fine, because they can discuss concepts and so on in first language. But underpinning all of this in terms of an inclusive pedagogy in the actual classroom is probably the most important aspect. It's the inclusive attitudes of the teachers. And we know that where teachers have really high expectations of the learner, we know a learner is much more likely to rise to that challenge. And so learners using EAL don't need a watered down curriculum, but one that's rich and it's relevant to them, but that's got the learning process is scaffolded rather than the actual content of it. So that takes us on to the second main point, and that was the urgent need for accelerated language support. So as we've already heard then, so the research from Joe Hutchinson and from Steve Strand shows the urgent need for accelerated language support. And in particular, that's for learners who are late arrivals. So in particular, thinking here of Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. Where their proficiency in English is actually is preventing them from achieving their potential. And then obviously that means then that learners who are at the earliest stages of proficiency, that's the second group that would need the urgent language support in order to push them through those proficiency levels as quickly as possible so that they can access the curriculum completely. So I know somebody has asked a question about this, about the idea of integrating students quickly into lessons. And we know that children who are newly arrived might benefit from some initial survival language types of intervention, but on the whole, language support should be integrated in curriculum learning rather than decontextualized. And there is often a place for small group interventions, but we would urge that this should be directly linked to the curriculum, whether that might be, for example, pre-teaching the language of a topic that's coming up, or teaching a grammatical structure that's needed in a lesson, for example, thinking of using the present tense to describe scientific facts. So we've already mentioned then that learners who are in the earlier stages of English language proficiency have double the job to do. They're learning the subject matter like their classmates, but they're also learning the language at the same time, and the curriculum isn't waiting for them to catch up. And so looking back at the idea that the integrated mainstream approach to inclusive practice, that this is the best model, it does place the subject teacher as crucial to teaching the language of the subject. You know, as Diana's mentioned about the funding for support, we know that not all learners will have the luxury of somebody going into their lessons to support, and so it does place a lot of pressure on classroom teachers to provide not just the subject knowledge but also the language. Nevertheless, we can't escape the fact that we can't separate the subject from language. The language of instruction is English, the language of assessment is English. We have to think about the subject in terms of the language that's needed to both teach the content but also to demonstrate understanding of the subject. So a great deal of time, we know, a great deal of time and care and expertise goes into planning a rich and varied curriculum for learners. And where the language demands of the curriculum are integrated alongside the subject content, learners will be better equipped to access the lessons and therefore make good progress. And we know Rishan was talking about the benefits of rigorous language support, where she was able to get the support from her teacher in terms of checking her written language use. And you know, the demands of the GCSE curriculum or going on to A-level curriculum, that they are huge, and having somebody who's able to look at the language and able to teach towards the language of the subject, as well as the subject information, will be really beneficial. That you know, that becomes a part of the norm of classroom provision. So the third point then was linked to that, is the case for assessing proficiency in English. And we know that knowing a learner's proficiency in English and how that might vary between the language skills. So, for example, that a learner might have a much higher proficiency level in speaking than they have in, say, reading or writing. We know that where we're confident in knowing that information, it will allow the language support to be as focused as possible, and it will enable classroom teachers to plan lessons that provide challenge but are also realistic. And I mean, there are obviously other assessment frameworks available, but if you want to find out more information about assessing proficiency in English, there is lots of information available on our website, and in particular the Bell Foundation Assessment Framework. So that takes us on to our fourth point, and that was linked to Diana's point, an asset-based approach to multilingualism. And we know that a new arrival, quite often their greatest asset will be their knowledge of their own language and any other languages. We know that, so I mentioned about maintaining home languages, that will be really important. But we know that the more that a child develops, say, their home language, it has a positive impact on the new language that they're learning. So it's that sort of like the language of languages. It's one will impact on the other. And schools can find great ways of not just showcasing the multilingual and the multicultural identity of the school, but really incorporating it into the school ethos. And one way of doing this might be to encourage, or even to expect a child to draw on the languages that they use. So whether that's allowing or encouraging or expecting discussions to take place between children who speak the same language, and arranging the classroom in such a way as to facilitate that, or allowing note-taking or providing materials that are dual language. There's a myriad of ways, and I know we've got much more practical webinars coming up at the end of the month on the 25th and 26th of May, which will consider these ideas. There's a piece of research, I'm sure that Silvana will be able to post the link, where Deirdre Kerwin, who's she had been a head teacher in a school in Ireland. And she's written extensively about the use of multilingualism in a primary school. So there's some really interesting and useful case studies in that you might find very useful and really inspirational about how the value of languages and how schools incorporated that into regular school life. And of course, as I mentioned before, the induction process and that initial meeting, it's a really good opportunity to find out more about a learner's literacy levels in their first language, and then sharing this information with the relevant teachers so that they can make good use of it. And so the preparation before a learner starts at the school is crucial, and one aspect of that might be finding out key information about the child's experience of education, what the education system might look like, for example. So this would give us some ideas about a child's expectations in terms of what the school day might look like, even, or what teaching looks like. And then finally, the importance of CPD on EAL, and we know that this is a massive ask. We know that welcoming new arrivals can be a very, very daunting prospect for classroom teachers. Schools are already busy and under a huge amount of pressure. Teachers are under pressure to meet targets, particularly where they've got examination classes. And research has shown us that teachers don't always feel prepared to meet the needs of learners who are new to English. And so where schools can provide opportunities for appropriate CPD, that will really pay off. It'll be really beneficial in making sure that there's time and opportunities for teachers to share good practice. And I'm sure Silvana will go on and mention the some of the courses that are coming up shortly. I'm just thinking about one of the questions that had come up about Key Stage 4 arrivals. There's Step Up to English is one option for that. It's another qualification that can run alongside GCSE. So thinking of students who are arriving in Key Stage 4, it might be that looking at Step Up to English, and then maybe with support from colleges where that's available, is one option. I've certainly used that in the past. So I'd really recommend that. And obviously GCSEs in home languages is another option. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to every one of you, Catherine, Caroline, Joe, Rishan, and Diana, for your insights, your input, all very interesting, useful. So over to questions from the audience. So the first question I think is for Joe, and it's from Christina. She says, thank you for the fascinating information on data around GCSE. Is there any similar data in terms of pupils' attainment at primary level?
Yes, there is. So the first piece of research we undertook in 2017 into the attainment of children who speak English as an additional language does include breakdowns at Key Stage 2, and that was in the first year of the current Key Stage 2 testing regime that uses. So I provided the link to the report on answer to the question. Should I also paste it in the chat box?
That would
Silvana?
be great. Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you. Okay, a question from Monica, and I think this we could start with Catherine answering, and maybe Rishan, if you want to come in on this as well. So Monica says, many of the volunteers I come into contact with are not language teachers, but are interested in supporting or befriending refugees. How can they be helped in this role?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Thanks, Monica. So one of the programs that we run is an educational mentoring program for young refugees and asylum seekers, where we match young people with community-based volunteers who help them with an agreed aspect of their education. And of course, that is often English language acquisition, and yet we have this challenge that, you know, although some of them do have ESOL or EAR teaching experience, that's the minority. And so I think we've put in place a number of things that have helped, and we're actually building on this work at the moment with the Bell Foundation. But kind of prior to that, some of the things that we'd found helpful were creating kind of peer learning forums within the volunteers that we work with. So when we have had, you know, a few that have had English language teaching experience, drawing on their expertise to create sort of libraries of resources and things like that that are shared between all of the volunteers, and just giving them a kind of basic equipping in their initial training around what is the education system in the UK, how does English language acquisition sort of track alongside that, and what are some of the key things that they can, ways in which they can support young people. And we found that in order to make that work, we've really needed to put the onus on young people bringing specific areas of work that they need support with to the mentor, rather than putting the onus on the mentor to kind of, you know, have a great understanding of the sort of ESOL curriculum and working out where they can enter it and what the young person should be doing. So partnerships with schools and colleges in that have been really important. What we're doing at the moment with the Bell Foundation that is something that we'd hope to be able to share much more broadly and widely once it's completed, is creating a framework that will enable non-specialist volunteers who are engaging in supporting language acquisition for children and young people to be able to, across kind of probably about 10 key areas, see where their young person is situated in a much more simplified way than in the ESOL national curriculum, and in key areas of language that are often left out of the national curriculum but are really key to young asylum seekers and refugees navigating their life in the UK. So like Rishan was talking about earlier, sort of that kind of education for learning. And providing a range of resources that volunteers will be able to use to navigate that. So that's something that we'd hope to be able to share along with some training sessions in due course. But I think the key things now for us, before we've kind of had the luxury of having that, have been drawing on ESOL teachers and EAR teachers to provide very basic level training as part of our volunteer induction, and then drawing on that peer network for shared resources.
Thank you, Catherine. Rishan, would you like to add anything from the projects that are going on at KRAN to help volunteers?
Yeah, similar to what Catherine she just mentioned in terms of mentoring, because we do have a mentor scheme in KRAN. Like it really helpful, because some of the young people, when they have any, like they have a presentation, so they have this person who helped them, like from the community. Because as I mentioned, I was lucky to be placed in a foster family where I have this, like show it to my foster care or do any presentation that I meant to do at college. So this person could help the young people in terms of like how to spell the words, or how to say, like to pronounce some of the words in their grammar, like reading or anything could be like really helpful. Obviously, like a teacher would be like much better, but again, kind of to have that kind of support and to build the confidence and to listen to what they, even me when I do any, like still now with the university, I ask my friend, could you read this for me, because am I writing something, but again, it's not like sure for me. So it was really helpful. A mentor could give this support to this person. So, yeah.
Thank you, Rishan. Thank you so much. The next question, I will begin with Caroline, but Catherine, if you want to add anything later. The question is how to support brand new year 11 students, only 2 weeks left of scheduled lessons in exams, which he won't sit. Any thoughts?
Goodness me, that's a difficult situation, isn't it? I think the key thing will be making sure that colleges signposted really clearly, and that using this time as well as possible to try to do some sort of language and the language of numeracy will probably be really useful at this point. But I would imagine that contacting local colleges would be a really good starting point, and seeing if they can offer any support. Catherine, you may have more experience with the college side.
Thanks, Caroline. Really, that's an incredibly difficult situation. And when I raised my hand earlier, it actually wasn't about this question. But I think one of the things that we found is, I mean, actually, we've had a young person in that situation kind of about this time last year, so kind of coming in, being put into year 11, the rest of the class doing GCSEs, and we've had it happen when teachers have taken just a kind of, well, they're attending and it's just kind of get through the next 2 weeks and do nothing more. And then in this case last year, we actually it was actually really great to see what happened. The teachers used those 2 weeks. They kind of actually did forget about the GCSEs. They kind of wrote that off. You know, it was really the only thing they could do given the circumstances. But they invested in, they got a teaching assistant to accompany him to look around the FE college that he was going to be starting in the following September, to get a real understanding of what his work there was going to look like. He got some like preparation work set by the teacher of the FE college for the course that he was going to transition onto, to help him do things over the summer that would then kind of plug that gap for him. And that was actually, for that particular young person, one of the most useful uses of that 2 weeks. And so I think from that, what we've kind of taken is just, if you are in that situation when the time has just run out, and you know, it's just not ideal, but what can you do to prepare the young person for the next stage, and focus on that rather than kind of forcing them into something that is it's just going to lower their confidence further.
Thank you. Well, the next question is similar. I'll ask it just in case you might want to add anything. So for refugees arriving in year 9 or year 10, what are the options for students who don't have enough English to pass GCSE English language and literature? That's probably for you, Caroline.
Step up to English is a really good option. And that can, it's progressive, so it goes up to gold, which does include a study of literature. So it can sit alongside GCSE or lead towards GCSE. So that's particularly useful, for example, where students will then go on to college and might have the option of sit in GCSE English language at college. Was there anything else in the question, Silvana? I think
there is another one about, let me just move it. Yes, functional skills as well.
Yes, yeah, functional skills is similar as well. But I would definitely say not to close down the option of leading towards GCSE English language at least. Literature is more difficult because of the context around it, but definitely English language. I would advocate putting support in to ensure that there's the option of progressing towards English language at least.
Diana, would you like to add anything about functional skills from what we heard from our colleges, or would you like me to add something there?
Go ahead, Silvana.
Okay, well, functional skills is not necessarily a qualification for speakers and users of English as an additional language. So it's a qualification that's designed for first language English speakers. So even though there are things and content that learners could find really useful, is not as useful as particularly doing the course. Yeah, it wouldn't be as useful as it would be to have some designated EAL support like you would have in college. Okay, moving on, another question, and this says, can I ask any of the speakers? So I will just read it to you, and feel free to answer any of you. As an experienced EAL teacher in a secondary school, I have always been told that students with EAL should be in curriculum lessons for the majority of time. Caroline, you talked about this, so I'm probably addressing it to you in particular, but probably is there anything else you'd like to add? Let me just finish reading it. This means that there is far less time for specific specialized language support. Many of our refugee students arriving in years 9 to 11 find being in curriculum lessons extremely difficult and become switched off from education. What are your views on this? So is there anything you would like to add in addition to what you said?
I mean, it is really, really difficult. One of the things that we did in the school that I was working in was that learners who were late arrivals did one fewer GCSEs, and we used the time that we gained from that particular option to provide a small group support that was focused on science, English language and maths, and one of the options, I think all of the students happened to be doing geography. So that we were really spending, it was 3 hours a week, we were spending that time in preparing learners so that they'd got more of the language to be able to go into the lesson and access that learning. Having said all that, I do know that it is really difficult in the secondaries where learners are arriving at Key Stage 4. And I think finding ways of sort of creating that sort of giving the message in as many ways as possible, whether that's encouraging families to be involved in the learning process, and providing materials that are in first language, or signposting materials that are in first language, so that learners have got an idea of what's coming up in the following week or the following half term, and that they can prepare a little for that at home. That's really useful. And again, the comment that I made about the sort of the way that language and the subject are interwoven, they're inseparable. And so making sure that teachers are confident about meeting the language demands of their subject and ensuring that children can be involved in the lessons so that they're not bored and they're not frustrated, and that they don't get switched off, and having that real culture of inclusion and high expectations of learners. We've certainly spoken to practitioners where they've seen children getting bored, and that's where behaviour problems can arise as well, where children are bored because the academic challenge isn't sufficiently high. So it's about structuring the learning process rather than simplifying the subject content, and making sure that the teachers are confident about how to go about that.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Catherine?
So this is kind of partly related to that question and partly to the previous question. I just wanted to, in case it's helpful for people to have a concrete school to look at, there's a school in Harlesden in London that I think is just doing a fantastic job on this, which is Newman Catholic College. They've got a very high number of refugee and asylum seeking students, and they've developed a really innovative programme, particularly for children at that older end. And one thing that they do in particular is they have a package of GCSEs, a sort of more reduced package of GCSEs with embedded EAR support. And that's part of what they call a projects-based learning system, where I think they have 6 different levels. And that sort of specialist package of GCSEs is the top one. And they assess children every 6 weeks to see if they're ready to move between levels. And so they really kind of overcome this thing of getting stuck at one level and not being able to access things because of limited English language. Obviously there's limitations to that, but it's a really interesting model to look at, and I think they're very up for sharing their expertise with other schools and colleges as well. So I think Newman Catholic College, if anyone wants to look them up.
Thank you. Tomorrow when we upload the video recording of this webinar, we will also share all the links with you that the different speakers have mentioned. So you will see the link tomorrow. Thank you. There's a question probably for Rishan and Catherine, short and sweet. Are there any organizations like KRAN in London, and perhaps I'm adding in any other parts of the country, that you are aware of?
To be honest, I'm not sure if there is, because KRAN stands for Kent Refugee Action Network. I know there is JRAN, which is Joint Action Network. No, Joint Refugee Action Network. So this can be helpful as well.
Thank you.
So we are, we would be one option, Refugee Education UK. We have kind of physical hubs in London, Birmingham, Oxfordshire and the east of England, where we run services, but the educational mentoring provision is everywhere, and then different hubs have different other programs depending on the kind of capacity and the kind of needs locally. Some of our other services are national, so our advice work you can access wherever you are because it's got an online component and training. Other organisations specifically in London that I'd encourage people to look up would be Young Roots. So they do quite a lot of work in schools and colleges, and it takes a slightly more kind of holistic approach. Another one would be Salisbury World, that's Salisbury, SALUSBURY, and they again work through schools, primary schools and secondary schools, but they particularly have a focus on wellbeing for the entire family unit. So if you've got families where you're trying to kind of provide language support, but there's also immigration and housing and things like that coming off there, they can be a really valuable resource in London. Yeah, I'm sure there's others, but that's a couple that come to mind straight off.
Thank you. There's a question about teacher education. I don't know, Caroline, whether you'd like to deal with that. If not, I'm happy. I'll read it for you. What about the future teachers? Do they have a part of their practicing learning journey that included EAL? The ones that I got in contact with looked like they just need the data, but that don't really learn about EAL. Any comments about this?
We know that there's certainly a place for teacher training, EAL and teacher training, and certainly research has shown that student teachers and newly qualified teachers don't feel confident about meeting the needs of EAL learners in the classroom. We have written 2 ITT modules which are freely available from our website. The first is an introduction to EAL, looking at contexts affecting outcomes and also looking at an inclusive pedagogy. And then the second one is language for learning, which is very much what we've been talking about here today, about combining the language demands with the demands of a subject, of teaching a subject. So those 2 modules, and then a forthcoming module later in the year on assessment, are already available for ITT providers.
Thank you. I'll just add a little bit here. What we know is that because IT provision is very varied across the country, we know as well that the content around EAL is very variable. So as part of the research that Caroline was mentioning, which we can share the link tomorrow, was conducted by a team coordinated by Dr. Yvonne Foley, and it's called EAL in ITE. We know that, as I said, is incredibly variable. So from 1 hour, everything you need to know about EAL, to more extended and more integrated EAL support. So in some cases, and also it all depends whether trainees do have access, student teachers do have access in their placement schools to children with English as an additional language or not. And that varies a lot depending on where the schools are based. So where that happens, then sometimes they can do assignments that include observation, etc. And in other cases that doesn't happen. But the more important thing here is that is not, every trainee teacher does need to know about because EAL isn't a subject, but it's a special, if you like, it's a concern. It's a concern, an area, just as, special educational needs would be, for example. So there is some content that it's important that every student teacher knows about EAL, but also the important thing here is that EAL is permeated and infused within any and every subject in the curriculum, but also any concern, area of the curriculum, for example, feedback, for example, assessment, so that it's fully integrated and trainees think through what the implications are for children with English as an additional language, what kind of adaptations need to be in place. Okay, do we have any other questions? Let me double check yes, Diana mentioned how important it is to assess the proficiency of children. What is the best way to do this for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 children? Caroline, would you like to comment on that?
So I'm not a Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 2 expert, but we wouldn't advocate assessing proficiency straight away. Partly it's really important to allow children time to settle, but also because there will be a silent period. Most learners have a silent period while they're starting to learn a language, and they're understanding a lot more than they're able to produce, for example. In terms of assessing learners, after a shorter period of time, we would suggest more of a task-based approach, so that the classroom teacher or somebody working in the classroom can support those learners and can observe them in a really natural environment. So the Bell Foundation assessment framework has got a set of descriptors for each of the skill areas, and they're quite comprehensive. So it's 10 descriptors for each band, for each skill. And you know, that's really useful. It's really easy to tick those off in terms of what you can see a child doing. And it's important also to look at a child in different contexts. So it might be that different teachers can get involved with that process. So it might be the language of socializing, or the language of a conversation with a peer, or you know, looking at a child reading in a more formal situation, for example. So, but there's loads of information on our website about how to go about that assessment piece, including with Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 children.
And the last question. Somebody, Ivina, says that he's currently receiving students from Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Spain with different levels of English. I wonder if it's a good practice to keep them in with the same tutor group. They're currently doing so to create community and reinforce the social inclusion. However, I am unsure if we should create different after-school interventions specific to the English level, allowing them to tackle new English grammar more tailored to the level of English in order to keep challenging them and keep reinforcing their learning path. Any thoughts about that? Caroline?
So I'm just looking at the question and thinking about the idea of the same tutor group. So I'm guessing then that the tutor group is linked to how intervention might be provided as well. I mean, I would certainly not be advocating keeping all of the learners who are new arrivals in one group, but rather, you know, having, you know, a really lovely mix of children so that everybody can benefit from each other. So that the arrivals children who are new to English can benefit from the language models from their peers, from their first language English peers, but also so that the children in the main classroom can also benefit from getting to know children who've arrived from a new country and all that they have to offer. In terms of the after school intervention, I think making sure that that's subject specific will probably be the most important thing, and then linking that to the language demands of the subject. So, for example, looking at, I don't know, that like the use of the past tense in history, for example, then that would probably be the most useful way of going about it. Whether there's a need to break that down further into proficiency levels, is sort of having different groups for different ability groups, I suppose depends on how many learners you've got and how many staff you've got available.
Thank you so much. And thank you to every one of our speakers who have given us very useful information, ideas, recommendation, and we have a long list of links to share with you tomorrow. So thank you to Catherine, to Rishan, to Joe, to Diana, and to Caroline. And before I stop this webinar, I would like to give you some information about our forthcoming webinars and courses at the Bell Foundation, as well as some resources. As I said at the beginning, this is one in our series. We've got more webinars coming, and the next few webinars are even more tailored to practitioners, so to teachers, EAL coordinators, teaching assistants, etc. So we've got a webinar next Tuesday, the 11th of May at 4 o'clock, and this webinar is called Welcoming Ukrainian Arrivals, and here we will be focusing our guest speaker. Her name is Lena, and she comes from Ukraine, but she works in here in the UK and has done so for a long time, and she will talk to us about the education system in Ukraine to help us understand the children's background if they come from Ukraine, a learner's typical experience of school, languages spoken and typical literacy levels of students, and key features of the Ukrainian language, but also about parental engagement, and not just engagement, but also expectations that parents have about their children's achievement and about how to engage with the school and the school with them. So
Silvana,
yes.
the Someone's just posted in the chat that the 11th is actually a Wednesday. So could you
Sorry,
clarify
yes, no,
whether it's Wednesday the 11th or Tuesday?
It's Wednesday the 11th. Sorry, yes, it's Wednesday the 11th. Thank you. And also community involvement. On the 25th of May at 4 o'clock, there is a webinar called Supporting New Refugee Arrivals in the Inclusive Primary Classroom. And the following day, the 26th of May at 4 o'clock, we've got Supporting New Refugee Arrivals in the Inclusive Secondary Classroom. So they are similar, but they're tailored for primary or secondary education. In these webinars, we're going to be looking at the importance of collating and sharing information about new arrivals, the case for mainstream education, so the kinds of things that Caroline was talking about today, but in more depth, social inclusion, particularly the role of buddies, including those who speak the same languages, academic inclusion, supporting learners with the learning process, and parental engagement. And we also have a 3-hour online course at the start of next year, academic year, in September. It is a 3-hour course, however, over 4 weeks, so that participants have time, to look at the content in depth, and there is an implementation task that so that every participant can work at their own pace and in their own time. This course is called Supporting New Arrivals Who Are New to English, and this course is highly practical, and it's evidence-informed, and it will explore the kinds of support needs that need to be in place for learners who use English as an additional language before admission. So looking at all the help and support that we can give the child, but also their parents, before the pupil starts and joins the school, in the first days at school, but also during the initial weeks. So really looking forward to seeing you in the next webinars, and hopefully that if you can join us for the course as well. A quick reminder that you will get an email tomorrow with a link to the video recording of this webinar, and as I said before, all the links that our speakers mentioned. When you leave the webinar, a post-course evaluation form will appear, and you will get a link to the same form in the email tomorrow. We'd be very grateful if you could spend a few moments to complete it, as your views will help us shape our webinar program, but also other future events at the Bell Foundation. So thank you very much for taking part in today's webinar, and thanks again to today's speakers, Catherine and Joe and Rishan, Diana and Caroline. Thank you. Looking forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.